Well, today we're going to be moving into what is perhaps the most quintessentially economic idea that's out there, really. It's the thing that a lot of people, if they've had a class before and you ask them, what do you remember about economics? This is what they say. We're going to be talking about demand and supply, the two ideas that help us to understand how markets work. Markets are really important in our lives. We may not like the outcomes all the time, but without markets, the alternatives are not particularly great. So let's jump into that right now and start to explore what a market looks like. To start doing that, to start understanding markets, we have to first of all ask ourselves, how do we allocate goods and services? We mentioned this earlier, that the job of the economist is to study scarcity, how people with unlimited wants fulfill those wants with limited resources. Another way to ask a similar question would be to say, how do we get the things that we want? What's the process by which we do that? And there's lots of different ways this can happen. One way is that we could just all wait in a line. There's some massive store somewhere and it has everything that we want, but we have to wait to get it. And if they run out before we get there, well, that's just life. We could use a lottery system where if there is a new iPhone out, the people who get that iPhone are the people whose numbers are drawn out of a hat. That's a way to allocate goods and services. And these two ways might be very fair. We could distribute things very fairly through this process. It's who can wait the longest and whose number gets drawn. And maybe fairness is of interest to us. But these aren't the only ways we can allocate goods and services. We could also do it through bribery. So if somebody has a phone to sell, you could just pay them off and make sure that you get that. That may not seem very fair, but it's certainly a way to allocate goods and services. We could have rations, another fair way of doing things. We could just say that everybody gets the same amount of everything. Maybe it's not as much as you would like, but hey, other people need it too. So we could just ration all of the goods and services so that everybody has a little bit. Or we could use prices. Prices are a way that we allocate goods and services. You go into a store, and if you can pay the price that's being asked, you can get the good. Now, prices are not seen as fair necessarily, because sometimes you can't afford the things that you want. You may want to take a trip to, say, the Seychelles, an island group in the Indian Ocean, but it's really expensive. So instead, you go to Lake Erie. You really want to go to the Seychelles, but it's so expensive. And it's not fair that you can't go. But we have to allocate the resources to get you to the Seychelles in some way. Otherwise, there'd be lots of people overrunning the islands. And we do that through prices. Again, it's not the most fair, but as we're going to see, it's incredibly efficient. And that is one of the things that we have to try to figure out. One of the debates about markets in and of themselves is whether they are fair or not. And the answer is no, they're not fair. Not everybody gets the same amount of everything. But we have to weigh that fairness against the concept of efficiency. Do markets help us to produce as much stuff as we can out of the resources that we have at our disposal? That fairness, that equity versus efficiency debate is always kind of swirling around the idea of markets. People don't like that they're not fair, and that's understandable. But we have to weigh that against the alternative. If we did everything through a lottery or through rations, it would be fair. But would we get as much as we would like to have in society as a whole? And do the right people get goods? I mean, what if you don't like radishes, but you do like pickles? But everybody gets the same amount of both. What's going to end up happening, of course, is that people are going to trade the radishes for pickles. They're going to find someone who likes radishes, who has pickles, and they're going to trade those things. So people will decide on their own who gets what, eventually anyway. But if we could just eliminate that step through markets where you could just go in and buy the pickles that you want and not buy radishes, that would be much more efficient and a more efficient use of our time. So we're weighing that idea of efficiency and equity as we explore the ways we distribute goods. Now, for the most part, in our world, we use markets to distribute goods and services. We use the price mechanism. So let's start to explore that a little bit more to see how it is that prices get formed, because sometimes we don't like the prices. But let's take a look here at how those prices get formed so we can understand that a little bit better. To understand that notion of prices, we need to know a little bit more about markets first. Markets are places where buyers and sellers come together. Sometimes those markets are physical locations, like a Walmart store, or sometimes they're virtual places like Amazon and eBay. These are places that bring buyers and sellers together. We might have a physical location like the Home Depot store, but of course Home Depot and Walmart have these massive online presence now as well. Or it could be something less formal. This is a picture of a market nearby to where I live, out in Rogers, Ohio, and they have basically a flea market every week where there are people buying and selling all kinds of interesting things. Markets are places where buyers and sellers come together. In order to have a market, you must have a buyer and a seller. I mean, think about a late night TV infomercial where you have a seller and they're selling some kind of crazy tactical sunglasses, or they're selling, Snuggies or something like that. If they're trying to sell you something and you don't buy or nobody buys, then there's no market there. You have to have a buyer and a seller. Otherwise, it's just a seller out there flapping their gums, telling you how great their product is. If you just have a buyer and no seller, then it's kind of like you sitting around waiting for a flying car. You want a product, but nobody has developed it yet. So once again, there's no market. We're going to start off looking at markets from the demand perspective. This side of the market is the buyer's side. This is where the people who want something, they want to acquire something, they're on this part of the market. They make up this part of the market. We can define demand as being the amounts of a good or service someone is willing and able to purchase at given prices over a period of time. That's just kind of a textbook definition of what demand is. The amounts of a good or service someone is willing and able to purchase at given prices over a period of time. Now that definition has a lot going on in it, so I want to break it down just a little bit. First of all, I want you to notice that we are talking about two pieces here. We are talking about amounts, and we're talking about prices. So we have these two components, amounts and prices. And that's important because when we look at demand, we're looking at something that is being constructed out of two parts. There's two ingredients. You have to have amounts and you have to have prices. And it's important to understand this distinction because we're going to look in more detail at that amounts component of demand. And we're going to call it something that sounds like demand, but it's not demand. Demand has to have both amounts and prices. A second thing here that I want to pay attention to is this idea of willing and able. This part here. When we're talking about demand, we're talking about people who want to buy stuff, and that's important. But remember, in economics, we're always constrained by the idea of scarcity. So it's not just that you're willing to buy something. Heck, I'm willing to buy a beachfront house. The problem is I'm just not able to. And so if the price goes above a certain amount, I'm out. I'm not part of the market anymore. And usually that price is low enough that I'm never in the market. So you have to be able to because of scarcity. And again, we don't want to ever ignore or forget that we're studying scarcity when we study economics. And this willingness and ability to pay, that's just a way of saying that don't forget about scarcity. And then finally, we have this last bit, a period of time. When we look at demand, we're looking at the demand that exists over a period of time. Sometimes you don't demand certain things on a given day. So maybe you open up the refrigerator, there's a gallon of milk, and there's no demand for milk. Doesn't matter what the price is. You already have it. Instead, what we want to do is we want to look at people's demand for milk over a period of time. Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's a month, sometimes it's a year. But that period of time is important because otherwise we might miss some of the market. So that's demand. Demand is the amount of a good or service someone is willing and able to purchase at a given price over a period of time. Now, let's take a look very specifically at the relationship between prices, that one part, and the amounts. Now, that idea of an amount, we want to look at just a little bit more and give it a name. When we look at the amounts that people want to buy in the context of demand, we're going to call that amount the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded. This is not the same thing as demand. Demand is the price and the quantity combined. This is something different. This is just the amount. And we call it quantity demanded, and we abbreviate that with a Q and then a D beside that because we want to make sure we know it's the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded has a very special relationship with price. First of all, we call price the independent variable in this relationship because the price can move on its own. The independent variable. That's price. Price does what it wants. Quantity responds to price, which means the quantity is dependent. It's dependent, and the direction that it moves is dependent upon what happens to price first. So whenever there's a change in price, there's a change in the quantities that people are willing and able to purchase. When prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. The reason for that is very simple. If prices are higher, it's harder to afford more stuff. So when price goes up, say when Netflix raises its prices, people are going to buy fewer Netflix subscriptions. They might cancel what they have. They might reconsider. Now, there's other things that could have an impact on how many Netflix subscriptions you want to purchase. But right now, we're holding all else constant. We're just looking at one change, a change in the price of the product and what happens to the quantity demanded. And notice what happens when the price goes up. The quantity demanded goes down. When the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. These two things move in opposite directions. In fact, if we looked at another product, say gasoline, if the price goes down for gasoline, then what do you think is going to happen to the quantity demanded? If you set up, it's going to rise, then give yourself a cookie. Good job. If the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. Again, these things are moving in opposite directions, or we say that they are inversely related to each other. When the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. When the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. This relationship between quantity demanded and price is formalized in what we call the law of demand. The law of demand simply tells us what's the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And this is one of those relationships in economics that almost always, almost 100% of the time holds true. Think about things that go on sale. Why do companies put things on sale? That means they're going to get less money for every unit that they sell. Well, the answer is simple. They want to get rid of the stuff that they have to sell. So they lower the price because they know the law of demand. Law of demand tells them if the price goes down, then the quantity demanded is going to go up. And that helps them to sell things. The law of demand, now that relationship between price and quantity demanded is formalized in such a way that we can draw a picture of what it looks like. Let's take a look at that picture. To start off with, we need some data. So we have here what's called a demand table. The demand table gives you information about price and about quantity demanded. Here's the price column over here, and here's the quantity demanded column over here. And notice what happens. When price for a Netflix subscription starts to go up, when it goes from 10 to 12 to 14 to 16, look at what happens to the corresponding quantity demanded. At a price of 10, quantity demanded is 300 million. When the price goes up to 12, then Netflix subscriptions start to decline. The quantity demanded goes down. These are the amounts that people buy. And when the price continues to rise to 14 to 16 to 18, the quantity demanded goes down again. That's just the price. That's just the law of demand in action. Prices are going up. Oh man, price of my Netflix subscription just rose. What's going to happen? Well, we're not going to buy this. We'll save our money. And the quantity demanded goes down. Now we can draw that out in a picture to see what that looks like. Let's do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that information from the demand table and I'm going to plot it out. To do that, I need a space in which to operate. So I'm going to draw a line here and then another one over here along this vertical or the up and down axis. I'm going to label that as price. Now usually we just label that with the letter P. P stands for price. And that is going to give me all of my price information. So let's just say we start here at 10 and then have 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20. Along the horizontal axis, I'm going to have quantity, but I'm just going to label that with the letter Q for the most part. And along quantity, we have, we'll just start at 200 and then increase by 20 million units. Remember, this is quantity in millions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to plot my points out. So I had a point at which if the price was 10, then the quantity demanded was 300. Where those two little dashed lines intersect, I'm going to put a dot. And then when the price went up, people didn't buy as much. So there's 280 at a price of 12. And then I'm just going to keep plotting these points out. They fit the demand table, and my scale may be off just a little bit here as it's done freehand. But I've got my dots now plotted out, my price and quantity coordinates. And being as we have a set of dots, I want to connect those dots. So let me do that here. And when I do that, I have a line. I'm going to label that line with the letter D for demand. And what I have here is what's called a demand curve. The demand curve simply tells me the information that's in my demand table. And that's how I plot it out. Now, usually what we're going to do in this class is we're not going to worry about plotting the points out so much. We're just going to draw the line. But we know it's a demand curve because of the shape of the line. And there's some information within that demand curve that is really important for us to glean, to get out of that demand curve. So let's take a look here at in a little bit more detail at the demand curve. Okay, so once again, I'm going to just sketch out a demand curve here. There's my axes. There's my price axis. There's my quantity axis. So I'm ready to sketch in my demand curve, and there it is. So just again, a downward sloping line, just like we constructed a minute ago. I'm going to label that with the letter D. There it is, just again, so I know it's a demand curve. And what I want to do is I want to look at what happens when I change where I am located on the demand curve. So let's say, for example, that the price is here. I'm just going to call that P1, just a generic price. And that P1 is going to be connected to or linked to a specific quantity. So I drop straight down from that dot to find my Q1. So Q1 and P1 go together. If the price falls, I'm going to move to a new point on the demand curve. So look, I've moved from that P1 spot to this new P2 spot. And that, of course, is going to correspond to a new quantity. As the price drops, as you see with the red arrow, then that quantity should, of course, increase, because that's what the law of demand says should happen. So what I've done is I've gone from one spot on my curve, the spot here, that's where I was at P1 and Q1, and I've moved along the curve down to this new spot. The reason I've moved is because the price changed. The price changed and we moved along the existing curve to a new spot. That's what happens when price changes. But I want to emphasize this really, really important distinction. This is a change in quantity demanded. This is not saying the same thing as changing demand. We're not changing demand. The demand is represented by the demand curve, that green line, and the green line hasn't done anything. All we have done is seen a decrease in price, and as a result, we've moved along the demand curve to a new spot. That's it. For demand to change, that green line has to move, and it hasn't. So demand hasn't changed. In fact, we can say with a great degree of certainty that there is only one thing that will cause quantity demanded to move, and that is a change in price. A change in price causes a change in the quantity demanded. Let me just emphasize that point. A change in price causes a change in quantity demanded. A change in price does not cause a change in demand, because for a change in demand to occur, the whole line needs to move. So what does cause a change in demand? Well, pretty much anything else that impacts the buyer's behavior. Things like this. Ugh. This is my middle school life. Not really me, but this is what I saw every day going to school. Horrible, horrible fashion choices as far as the eye could see. These are things that change demand. What changes demand? Well, a change in tastes. A change in what people think is in fashion. This is one of the major things that causes a change in demand. Fortunately today, the demand for these things is really, really, really low. But when I was in high school, the demand for these things were really high. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, let's examine this. So we're going to just draw on a demand curve for 80s style fashion. So here's price and here's quantity. And here's our demand curve. So again, this is 80s fashion. That's the good we're looking at. And what we've seen is that in the 1980s, demand for these kinds of things shifted. And what we saw was the entire demand curve move. This is what we call an increase in demand. And I want you to notice something about this increase in demand. An increase is always a shift to the right of where you start. It's always a shift to the right of where you start. Now, over time, what we've seen is that the demand for 80s style fashion has mercifully gone away. We've seen that there's a decrease in demand. So we'll just say this is demand today, where some people want it for costume purposes. It's not that nobody wants it anymore, but for the most part, most people don't want this. And so what we have is a decrease in demand, and decreases are always shown as shifts to the left. This is what we mean by shifting the demand curve. The whole curve has moved. So at any given price, there are different quantities demanded. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. Let's say this is our price. We'll just call it P1. Well, at P1 today, the quantity looks like this. But at that same price, we'll go out here to the 80s demand curve. At that same price, look at the difference in quantity. We have two different demand curves, or three different demand curves really. We have our first demand curve is our demand today, and at a given price, quantity demanded is very low. At that 80s demand curve, quantity demanded is very high at the same price. Basically, we have two different demand tables giving us information about price and quantity demanded. But when the tastes change, the tastes for 80s fashion, it shifts the demand curve so that at a specific price, we have different quantities. That's what happens when we shift demand. If the only thing that changed was price, then we would be moving along the existing demand curve. But that's not what's happening. In this case, something more fundamental has changed. And there are other of these fundamental shifters in demand. In fact, that's what we're looking at here. Things that we call demand shifters. Our first is a change in tastes. But there are others. So let's take a look at some of those others. One of the more obvious changes, demand shifters, things that cause the demand to change other than taste, is a change in your income. Hopefully you're going to be graduating from Robert Morris, you're going to get a job, you're going to have more money, and as a result of that, you're going to be able to buy more things. A change in income changes demand. A higher income means an increase in demand, and if you unfortunately lose your job, that's going to cause demand to fall. A change in the number of buyers is another one of our demand shifters. If we just have more people interested in a product, then the demand for that product changes. So we see this with smartphones. It used to be there wasn't a demand for a smartphone because they didn't exist, so there wasn't even a market. And then initially, not that many people were interested in this product, but as the number of people interested in having a smartphone has increased, we see an increase in demand for the product. Another thing that changes demand is a change in expectations. This refers to what you think the price of something is going to do, the price in the future. Now you say, wait a minute, I thought prices changed, quantity demanded. What are you talking about here? Well, what I mean is, what do you think is going to happen to price? It may or may not happen. But what are your prognostications? What are your visions of the future? This is one of the things that drives stock prices. If people think the price of a stock in the future will be higher, then today their demand goes up. If they think the price will be lower in the future, then today their demand goes down. This is basically stock picking 101. Buy low and sell high. If you think the price was going up, you buy low. That means higher demand today. Another demand shifter is a change in the price of related goods. How do goods relate to each other? In the case of coffee and donuts, these goods are special because they're called complements. They go along with each other. Let's take a look at how the change in the price of related goods affects demand. So let's say that we are looking at the market for donuts. That's what we're interested in. And if the price of coffee changes, let's say the price of coffee goes up, that's going to have an impact on the demand for donuts. What do you think is going to happen to the demand for donuts if the price of coffee goes up? Well, think about it. If you have coffee with your donuts and the one thing gets more expensive, then it's likely that your demand for those donuts is going to go down. And if this is the relationship, we know that the goods are complements. They go together, and if one gets more expensive, you buy less of the other. Of course, the opposite would happen as well. If the price of coffee goes down, then the demand for donuts goes up. Those goods are complements to each other. Now, what if we were looking at, instead of the price of coffee, let's say that there's the price of something that might be able to replace a donut. I mean, I'm not sure that there's much that could replace a donut, but maybe we have something that could replace a donut. Let's say the price of a bagel, but not just any bagel, a cinnamon crunch bagel from Panera. Oh, those are so good. Let's say the price of the bagel goes down. What do you think that's going to do to the demand for donuts? If you said the demand for donuts is going to go down, move to the head of the class, because you're right. In this case, what we're dealing with are not complements, but rather substitutes. The substitute for a donut is a cinnamon crunch bagel, and if that bagel becomes cheaper, relatively speaking, because nothing else has changed, just the price of the bagel, then the demand for donuts is going to go down. And the reverse would be true. If the price of the bagel goes up, if Panera jacks up their prices, you say, well, I don't want any of that. I will go down to Dunkin' and get myself a nice donut. So here we're talking about price changes, but price changes of some other good and how they affect the good we're interested in, how they affect the demand for the good we're interested in. If the price of one thing causes the demand for the other to go in the opposite direction, we have complements. If the price change of a good causes the demand for the good we're interested in to go in the same direction, then we're dealing with substitutes. Okay, now just to reiterate what we've been talking about here as far as changes in demand. When we are talking about a change in demand, this is what we mean. A movement of the curve. So in this case, we have a move from D1 to D2. That's a shift to the left. So that means we have a decrease in demand. And if the curve moves in the other direction, if it moves to the right of where we started, then that means we have an increase in demand. So going from D1 to D3 is an increase in demand. The whole curve has shifted. Those shifts occur because of the demand shifters that we just talked about. Changes in tastes, changes in income, changes in expectation, changes in the price of a related good, change in the number of buyers. Those things are forces that shift demand. But notice what is not on the list. There's nowhere that we say that a change in the price of this good causes a change in demand. That's not what's going on here. Okay, now I want to just say one last thing about demand before we move on to supply, and it's this. When we look at demand and we look at the prices that people pay, there is usually a gap between what you would pay and what you would have paid if you had to. Basically, if you walk into a store and you see something on sale and you buy it, you kind of chuckle to yourself as you're checking out. I would have paid more. But I'm not going to. I'm not an idiot. They say, hey, here is the price that we are charging. This is what you have to pay. And you say, okay, but I would have paid more. The idea of what we call consumer surplus is this realization. It's the gap between what you would have paid and what you did pay. It reflects your willingness to pay. And I have a picture of Wonder Woman here because if you know anything about Wonder Woman has a magic lasso. And if you get trapped by the magic lasso, you are compelled to tell the truth. So what we would like to do is we would like to get people, if you're a seller, you would love for people to tell you the truth and pay what they would be willing to pay. But we can't do that. There's no magic lasso out there. So instead, we charge people a price, and if they pay it, we know they're willing to pay it. And just realize that they would have probably paid more if they had to. What does that look like? Well, here's what it looks like. Once again, we have a demand curve. Here it is. It's our downward sloping demand curve. And we know that along this demand curve, there are various prices that you would be willing to pay. So up here, we'll just call this P high, PH for high price. And then down here is PL. This is the low price. And if people paid the low price, they would buy a lot. If people had to pay the high price, they would not buy as much. But let's say that the price that's actually charged is right here. So this is the actual market price. This person who would have paid a high price but only has to pay the market price, they get an amount of consumer surplus equal to this vertical distance that I've just kind of dotted out here. That's their consumer surplus. Let's say that the high price was, say, $100, and the market price is, let's just say $50. That means that this person receives consumer surplus equal to 100 minus 50, or $50. Hey, basically, it's money in their pocket. Hey, I went to the store, I expected to pay 100, but I only paid 50. Wow, look at me, I'm awesome. I'm so happy. I've got consumer surplus in my pocket. Now, there are other people, of course, who would pay less than 100, but more than 50. There's definitely somebody in here who would have paid 75. And so they also get consumer surplus. It's not as much as the person who would have paid 100. But now we have a second person who gets consumer surplus, that I'm just going to denote here with the CS, of 75 minus 50. So now the total consumer surplus that's produced is the 50 plus the 25. But we also know that there's lots of other people sort of in between here, in between the high price of 100 and the 75 price, there's lots of other people in here who would pay these various prices and would also get this additional consumer surplus. In fact, based on the way a market works, there should be people at every price along this demand curve so that this entire area gets filled in with people who have a willingness to pay above 50, but they only have to pay 50 all the way up to this point here. And maybe this point is maybe 115. So that's where the demand curve hits the price axis. So we have someone who would pay 115, but they only have to pay 50. And we have someone who would pay $50.01, but they only have to pay 50. And then we have someone who is only willing to pay 50, and they pay 50. And so we get out to here, and this is the quantity demanded at 50. But everybody who would be willing to pay more than 50 but doesn't have to gets a little bit of consumer surplus. And so this entire area, the area above the price and below the demand curve, that equals the picture of consumer surplus. Okay, so that idea of consumer surplus is going to come back to us a little bit later. We're going to use this to try to understand issues of efficiency in the markets. But for now, we're going to bail out on demand and move to the other part of the market, the other side of the market, the side that we call supply. The supply side is the seller's side of the market. And that's a little bit different because most of us haven't had to deal with the supply side before. Yeah, we've bought things from sellers, but we haven't been the sellers ourselves. So a lot of what we're going to look at here with supply is going to mirror demand, but it's not the same thing. There are some definite differences, some nuances on the supply side. So I don't want to lose you here. Let's take a look now more closely at the supply side of the market. Okay, so we're talking about the supply side of the market now. This is the seller's side. These are the producers, the people who are looking to sell things to the buyers. And we can define supply in a very similar way to how we define demand. Supply is the amounts of a good or service someone is willing and able to produce this time at given prices over a period of time. So we see some very similar things to what we saw with our definition of demand. There are amounts and prices. Just like we saw with demand, there are two parts to supply. It's the amounts or the quantities of a good or service, and there are prices, and you have to have both things or you're not going to have supply. There is also this notion of being willing and able. Many sellers are willing to sell you stuff, but the question is, are they able to produce it? They have to have enough income in order to buy the inputs to make the stuff that they are trying to sell you. They have to be able to do this. And if they're not, then that's not really anything that we need to concern ourselves with in terms of supply. And then it's also looked at over a period of time. So usually production of most goods takes a little bit of time. So if you're growing tomatoes, you don't just put a tomato seed in one night and have a tomato plant with ripe tomatoes the next day. So agricultural production takes time, and so we want to look at the production over a period of time and see if people are willing and able to produce amounts at various prices. So that's what we're looking at here when we look at supply. Supply are the amounts or the quantities of a good or service someone is willing and able to produce at given prices over a specific period of time. Now, just like there was a relationship between price and quantity demanded, now we have a relationship between price and quantity supplied. So quantity supplied, those are the amounts of those goods and services. And it's related to price. Price is still the independent variable. It moves first. And quantity supplied is the dependent variable. It reacts. The difference here is the relationship between the two. When prices go up, then the quantity supplied of things follows that price. So in the housing market, for instance, if prices of houses start to climb, it's more likely that someone is going to put their house on the market to sell. They say, well, I'm not going to sell my house below this price. Oh, wow, look at prices going up. Maybe it's time to sell. And that makes all the sense in the world. Businesses want to make more money. Sellers want to make more money for the things that they sell. So if the prices that they can sell their products for go up, they're going to try to get more of their product to market. That just makes sense. So what we have here is a direct relationship, so that if price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. These things move in the same direction. Now, the alternative, sort of the opposite of this, is when prices go down, the quantity supplied tends to drop. And this may seem at first a little bit odd. If the price goes down, wouldn't a business want to try to sell more and produce more in order to overcome or compensate for that lower price? And the answer is that's what they may want to do, but are they able to do it? Remember that issue of ability to produce. They may not be able to cover their costs of production if the prices that they sell their products for are too low. So if the prices of cars go down, car manufacturers may just say, yeah, we're not going to produce as many. Or we're at least not going to bring them to market because we can't cover our costs if the price is too low. So the relationship between price and quantity demanded was opposite, was indirect. Here the relationship is direct. When price moves in one direction, the quantity supplied follows. But remember, all of this happens ceteris paribus. All of this happens all else equal. So everything else in the economy stays the same. There's no change in demand. And there's no change in supply. All we're talking about is a change in price. And remember, changes in price didn't change demand, and they're not going to change supply either. Let's take a look specifically at that concept by looking at a supply table. This is just data. Instead of being from the demand side, this is data from the supply side. And as price goes in this direction, so price is going up 10 to 12, 12 to 14, 14 to 16, look what happens at the quantity supplied. It's going in the same direction, 220, 240, 260. So as the price rises, going from 10 to 12, the quantity supplied rises from 220 to 240. Maybe Netflix is now able to buy more server space so they can service more clients. They're able to cover their costs, and they're able to produce more content and produce more subscriptions. This is a clear representation of what we call the law of supply, which we just saw on the last slide. The law of supply, as opposed to the law of demand, which told us that as price goes in one direction, quantity demanded goes in the other direction. The law of supply says that as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up as well. That's what we see in our supply table here. And if price goes down, quantity supplied is going to go down. That's the law of supply. Just like we have a law of demand. The law of supply just gives us an indication of what the reaction will be to a change in price on the part of the seller. The sellers are the people who produce things. They are the people who supply goods and services to the product market. And they're the people who supply goods and services to the resource market, the sellers. So what does this look like in the context of a supply curve? Well, what we're going to do is just take this data and plot it out, just like we did with our demand curve. So we'll draw out our space here. This is quantity and price. So constructing a supply curve is going to look just like demand curve, at least at the start. And then we're going to have our prices along our vertical axis here. We'll start here at 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20. And then our quantities along the axis here. So we have 200, 220, 240, 260, 280, and 300. And we're just going to take the data that we had in our supply table and plot it out. So at a price of 10, the quantity supplied was 220. At a price of 12, the quantity supplied was 240. At a price of 14, the quantity supplied was 260. And then at a price of 16, the quantity supplied was 280. And a price of 18, the quantity supplied was 300. So there are our dots. That's just the data that we had from the supply table, and we connect those dots and we label it with the letter S so we know we're talking about supply, and here is our supply curve. Now the supply curve reflects the law of supply. We know that because the law of supply tells us that price and quantity move in the same direction, so that as price goes up, the quantity supplied increases as well. That's going to give us this positive upward slope to the supply curve. If the price rises again, the quantity supplied reacts and we move in this direction. So as price rises, we move along the supply curve in a northeasterly direction. That's the supply curve reflecting the information in the supply table and reflecting the law of supply. Just to reiterate that, and to reiterate the point that we have not changed supply yet, let's take a look at a supply curve. We're not going to plot the points out. We're just going to sketch it in here. So there's our price and our quantity variables, and there's our supply curve, labeled with an S, once again, so we know it's supply. If we're at this dot on the supply curve, this would be P1 and Q1. So there's where we start. If the price were to change, that would move us along the supply curve to a different price-quantity combination. So in this case, the price has very clearly gone down. And when prices go down, what happens to quantity supplied? Well, here we can see very, very clearly, we see that the quantity supplied goes from Q1 to Q2, so it has also decreased. What we have here is a change in quantity supplied. A change in quantity supplied is brought along by a change in price. This is not a change in supply. Remember when we talked about demand? To change demand, the whole curve had to move. Here we're changing supply. We're not changing supply, we're changing the price. I know I'm not changing supply because the curve itself has not moved. We still have this singular red line. We've just moved from one spot on the curve to another, and that is entirely a result of a change in price. Remember, a change in price causes a change in quantity supplied. A change in price does not cause a change in supply. The curve didn't move. In order for supply to change, something else has to change. Price isn't going to get it done. We need to hold, instead of holding all else constant and looking at a change in price, we need to say, what else could possibly change? And we call those things supply shifters. We call the things that change the demand curve demand shifters. These aren't changing the demand curve. These are changing the supply curve. These are things that affect the behavior of the seller. So if you were to say, well, a change in income happens. Well, a change in income affects the buyers, not the sellers. So it's not going to change supply. What is going to change supply? The number one most important thing that would change supply, the thing that almost exclusively changes supply, is a change in the cost of production. There are lots of different costs of production for a business. Whether the workers' wages go up or down, whether you have to pay them more benefits or fewer benefits, whether you have to buy, whether the price of your inputs, your major inputs, so if you're McDonald's, if the price of beef goes up, those are changes in costs. If the changes in your cell phone plan go up, if the changes in the light, if there's a change in the light bill, those are changes in costs, and those change the supply shifter. If costs go up, then supply is going to go down. And if costs go down, then that means supply will go up. And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a minute. This is the most important of all of the supply shifters. We'll take a look at a couple of other ones here. Taxes and subsidies. You can think of taxes certainly as a cost of doing business, but because it's a specific policy, we tend to look at this a little bit differently. If taxes go up, supply comes down. If taxes go down, supply goes up. Now, a subsidy is sort of a reverse tax. A subsidy is when government gives you money to produce things. This has often been the case in clean technology or clean energy, where governments help to support the production of goods, like solar panels, like electric cars, because we want more of them, but it's expensive to produce those things. If a subsidy increases, you can almost think of this as an opposite cost. So this very specifically is for a subsidy. If the subsidy goes up, then businesses can afford to produce more, so supply goes up. And if the subsidy is taken away, so the subsidy goes down, then that's going to cause the supply to go down as well. Notice that what happens with taxes look more like what happens with costs, but subsidies are governments giving a company money to produce more of a good. A change in the input availability or quality. This will affect your ability to produce things. So if there are more workers with high-tech skills, that's good for business. It shifts the supply curve. It increases supply. If the quality of the worker goes up because more people are being educated or more people are being trained, that causes supply to increase. If, say, the government prohibits people from moving into the country, if immigration laws are put in place, that changes the availability of labor, and that causes supply curves to shift. A change in the expectation about future price. That is similar to what we saw with demand. If you think the price of the product you're going to sell today is going to be higher in the future, then maybe you don't sell as much today. So if you think prices in the future are going to go up, then your supply today goes down. This is one of the reasons why you don't see Christmas trees for sale in July. Because we know, sellers know, they can't get a price for a Christmas tree in July. They need to wait for the future. So the supply is low today, but it will be higher in the future. And of course, if you think the price in the future is going to go down, you want to sell as much as you can today. You want to get your product to market as fast as you can. Another shift is a change in the number of sellers, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about market structure and competition. With more sellers in a market, the market supply will be higher, and that's good for consumers. So these are some of the supply shifters. Oh, one more there. A change in the price of related goods, of course. A great example of this is with the car industry. Ford is saying to themselves, well, if I can get a higher price for trucks, why would I produce as many cars? So if the price of trucks goes up, the supply of cars is going to go down because you can get a higher price for the related good. Ford just needs to retrofit their factory a little bit and they can make more money. So these are things that cause the supply curve to shift, the entire curve. And so what are we looking at when we have a change in supply? We're looking at this. That change in the curve from S1 to S2, that movement to the left of the original curve, that is a decrease. And it's important that you understand a shift to the left is a decrease in supply. It looks like it's an increase if you think about this in terms of up and down. And that's where the problem lies. It's better to think about these things in terms of right and left. A decrease is a move to the left. Whether you're talking about a decrease in demand or a decrease in supply, you can think about moving to the left as a decrease. This movement, even though it looks like it's a downward movement, is a movement to the right of where you started. And because of that, this is an increase. An increase in demand was a shift to the right. An increase in supply is also a shift to the right, even though it looks like you're going down from where you started. Think about these things in terms of right and left. Let me just draw in a line here just to illustrate this point. We'll go with this. So we have a line at a particular price. We'll call this P1. Look at what happens. Here's where we start. And that corresponds to, we'll just say Q1. At that same price, on the supply curve S2, we see that quantity has fallen. That's why a shift to the left is a decrease, because at the same price, the quantity supplied has fallen. And on S3, we see that the quantity supplied, call this Q3, has gone up at that same price. So shifts to the right are increases, shifts to the left are decreases. And this is an incredibly important distinction, because when we start to put the pieces of this model together, which we will do, and we start to use the model to predict what's going to happen in the markets, we've got to move our curves in the proper direction. Otherwise, our predictions are going to be fatally flawed. So, last thing about supply, and that is Wonder Woman again. We have this thing called consumer surplus with demand, and we have a similar thing with supply. Producer surplus is a reflection of the willingness to sell. Hey, I'm willing to sell my product. And producer surplus is the gap between what you get paid and what you would have accepted just to cover your costs if you had to. But most of the time, businesses sell at a price above cost. Well, a lot of times anyway. Producer surplus is this reflection of the willingness to sell. And it's, again, think about Wonder Woman with her magic lasso. If she were to put this lasso around a seller and say, what is the lowest price you would sell for? You'd have to tell the truth. And it just so happens that the lowest price a producer would sell their product for corresponds to a point on the supply curve. Let me show you what that looks like. All right, so let's draw in our supply curve. Here's our quantity and price axis. We'll draw our supply curve in, so it looks like this. Now, every point along the supply curve represents a price that a seller is willing and able to sell for. but they would of course like to sell at a higher price. So let's say that they're able to sell their product at the market price, and we'll say the market price is $50, just to give us some context. At $50, the quantity supplied in the market is right here. But there are some sellers who would sell at a lower price. So down here, this low price, let's just say it's $5, is the minimum price a seller would accept. If they have to sell for less than $5, they're not selling anything. They're not able to. But because the market says you can sell your product at a price of $50, this seller is very, very happy. They receive producer surplus. And for them, the producer surplus is equal to the $50 they sell for minus the minimum, because the minimum is really just covering your cost. And so that seller gets $45 in producer surplus. Now there are other sellers, let's just pick this one here, who would also sell at a price below market if they had to. Let's say that that's $20. That would cover their cost of production, but they also get paid $50. So our second seller doesn't get as much producer surplus. They start at $50. That's what they get paid minus their cost. So they get $30. So now we have $75 of producer surplus generated, and there's going to be producer surplus here, and there's going to be producer surplus here, and here, and here, at all of the various prices along that price axis up to $50. So we would have some consumer surplus here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. In fact, all over the place, so that this entire triangular area here gets filled in. This whole area represents the market producer surplus for all of the sellers in the market. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price. And it represents value to the seller above their cost of production. Producers love producer surplus as much as consumers love consumer surplus. Okay, so that's the basics of demand and supply. Currently, though, we have them sort of existing in separate spaces. There is the demand space and there's the supply space. But as I mentioned before, you've got to have these two things brought together, otherwise you don't have a market. And what we'll do when we get together next time is we're going to put those two things together to see how the market functions as demand and suppliers, as the buyers and sellers get together, and that's going to help us to understand how a price gets set.